I'm a European who's been living in the US for almost a decade, and I'm married to an American. And I have some opinions on why America sucks and why it's amazing. And also why Europe sucks and why it's amazing. Americans and Europeans have had a long history, obviously starting with the foundation of America. And America was largely built with European immigrants, not solely, but there was a big history part of it. Ever since, I feel like Europe and the US has had this kind of love-hate battle, as shown by things like the Writers' Cup. And in this video, as a European living in the US, I want to kind of cover some of my thoughts on the pros and cons of the American culture versus European culture. So I'll start with the negatives about America and then end with the positives about America. And these are kind of the opposites for Europe. So I'm also going to start with stuff that Europeans are good at and then end with stuff that Europeans are not so good at. And at the end, you as a viewer can make your own decision which culture wins. Hopefully you're not biased in either way. One thing that Europeans say about Americans that I feel like is very true is that inauthenticity around especially daily communication. So if an American says, "I'll see you later," it does not mean you'll see them later. Or like, "Oh, we should hang out." It does not mean you will hang out. It's just a thing to say when you leave.
Always a pleasure.
And the communication is very upbeat and happy, but it's very overly kind of polite. I'll get back to that point in later. But in a way, like, you can't really take Americans by the word, or like if they want to meet up with someone, you have to always double check because Americans are very flaky. And even like Southern Europeans, I haven't had this experience happen. Like if they promise to meet you, they usually meet you. They might be late, but they will come and meet you, versus in America, they will just cancel. The other thing that Europeans like to make fun of about Americans is the consumerism. And this is very true. And it's probably worse than you even think. The debt that Americans are in is ridiculous. At the same time, the incomes are very, very high. So it's not unrare to have like a six-figure income and then still work paycheck to paycheck. Versus in Europe, like if you make 30, 40K, you might be saving, which is ridiculous. And it's not just the cost of housing. Like in Helsinki, apartments might cost the same as in LA or New York. And so the cost of buying a property might not be that different. But people just buy more stuff and it's very addicting. And after living here, I'm noticing myself buying stuff that I don't need. And like a small house in America is a huge house in Europe. So if a big house in America is massive, and do you need all those bedrooms and you know all that space? And I think that is the less attractive part about America. Another thing that Europeans like to make fun of about America that I feel like is true both culturally and physically, especially the Southern Europeans, is the food. Like if you talk to any European, they're like, yeah, American food sucks. Although you can get burgers anywhere now and everybody seems to love burgers. Nevertheless, like people love to make fun of American food, and at the same time, Americans love European food, particularly Italian food. And the fact is not the style of dishes and cuisines, because you can make amazing dishes in any style in any cuisine in the whole world. The quality of ingredients in America are baseline poor. So yes, there are fancy grocery stores that sell you biodynamic, amazing stuff. But if you buy an average food and the quality ingredients, it's just worse. It's to the point where you buy like, Heinz ketchup, and you buy the same ketchup in Europe and it has less ingredients. It's a cleaner label product in the UK and than it is in America. The food sucks, people are flaky, and people love buying stuff. Usually stuff they don't need to impress people they don't care about with money they don't have. Then to the things that I feel like are partially true, partially not true. Like both parties kind of don't say the big picture. Europeans like to say that Americans are dumb and not cultured. And this is partially true and partially not true. Americans are very smart and very knowledgeable about many things. Geography and worldly things might not just be it. So when you follow politics, they know a lot about how political sciences work. They just don't know that much about stuff happening in Asia or overseas, unless there's a war where US is part of. And that makes sense. Like if you compare US and Europe, Europe has like almost twice the population, but by geography size, depending how you define Europe, they're roughly the same size. So like Europeans mostly know about European things too. They don't know as much about stuff happening in Africa or South America either, but they know a lot about happening within Europe. So this is kind of partially true, partially not true in my opinion. Americans are not dumb, but they are not great in geography. In America, 100 years is a long time. In Europe, 100 miles is a long distance. And when I was living in Switzerland, I could literally go for a run, a morning run, and I would be in another country. So you were just by geography very exposed to different cultures. And within a very short flight or drive, you would be in a totally different culture. And ever since you're a kid, you see TV and movies, at least in Finland, I saw movies from Germany and Italy and Spain, and you were exposed to a lot of things. And at the same time, there was hundreds of years of history. Like our farm has been with us now for 13 generations since at least 1619. And that's impressive, but not like super impressive for a European. In America, that's unheard of. Like to have a farm of 100 years is like a great accomplishment. So, and here people hop on a road trip and they might drive 12 hours and that's not a big deal. The other thing that Europeans love to say is that Americans are very capitalistic or greedy. And obviously capitalism is a big part of American culture. I would say it's a big part of global culture. It's definitely a big part of Western European culture too. So Americans are not alone in this boat, right? And there's big finance hubs such as like London and Switzerland and places where this happens too. But Americans overall is seen as more capitalistic. And I actually think this is a positive, and I'll get back to innovation and progress and having an open mind on the positives. But in general, Americans are maybe more pro-capitalism, and it's all about the Benjamin's baby. And in that way, I think it drives a lot of progress, but it has a dark underbelly. And this dark underbelly is particularly seen with things like homelessness and mental health issues, but it also drives progress. So are Americans overall greedy? I would say no. Americans are very charitable too. I know a lot of Americans who love to give back to the community, maybe even more than the Europeans. But it is definitely subconsciously or consciously a big part of driving forces is to make a lot of money. And that forces people to take risks and make choices and decisions that many end up being helpful. But again, if they don't succeed, there's a dark underbelly to that culture. And then the other thing that's partially true, partially not true is that I once read that what's the weirdest thing about America is that every few years, the government admits that they lied to the citizens or they hid something 25 years ago. And then they're like, what are you going to do about it? And I think we've seen this over and over again where a lot of these conspiracies ended up being true. And we found out that the US government or a government agency or a group of people were lying or hiding something. And later you found out that they were totally lying to the population, including the US presidents we all know that this has happened multiple times.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
We must stop the terror. I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
So in a way, yes, the US government has maybe lied to its citizens a few times and hidden a couple of dirty secrets, or presidents might have told a lie or a white lie or both multiple times and gotten caught later. And nothing changes. But this is not any different between Europe either. So if this is a cultural war between America and Europe, this happens a lot in Europe too. I would argue more. There's a lot of corrupt countries within Europe. Not all of them, but I would say even Finland, who's considered as one of the least corrupt countries, is also corrupt in kind of an underbelly systematic way. And so I think it's probably true that there is a lot of lies by the government in the US, but at the same time, like that happens in Europe too. So I really can't hold that against Americans. Okay, that was like a lot of negatives against America, but it's actually one of the greatest countries in the world. You could even argue in certain ways it's the greatest country in the world, and the results show for it. could be a hater and say they're not great, but if you look at the numbers, ball don't lie, numbers look pretty good. So the same way as you could hate LeBron as a basketball player, but you kind of have to give him his roses. It's like, yeah, you're one of the greatest basketball players of all time and the greatest of your generation, or pick any other sport and any other athlete. America is great, and it's an incredibly beautiful country first and foremost. It's a pristine piece of land with a lot of diversity and amazing places. So if you ever get to visit national parks or state parks, it's a pleasure, I can tell you that. But also from a cultural point of view, they have a lot of reasons why America has been successful, and I honestly think why still today many immigrants want to move here. And there's a reason why immigrants don't want to move to certain countries or want to leave their own home countries, even if they talk shit about America. It's just like people talk shit about America because America is so dominant, it's so in your face. So what are the positives about America? And by the way, these are also very much the negatives about Europe. The first one might surprise you. It's about being polite. Americans are very well-mannered, very polite. Even in New York City, which has a reputation of being kind of like rough and tough place, people are very polite. Like if they bump into you, they apologize and they're very nice. And after living in places like France or Italy, like people are not polite and they're rude and yes, they can turn the charm on if there's an official like black tie event and then everybody is proper. But overall, every day to day, you go and buy something from a cafe or whatnot. Unless you're in the countryside or a smaller place, usually you find Europeans be not as polite and the service sucks, like in almost every country, including Finland. Second thing that I think Europeans get wrong and America dominates is that Americans are way more hardworking, like way more hardworking. And growing up in Finland, we were always taught that Finns are super hardworking, and they're not. Like it's like crazy, and the data shows it. Like people barely work 40 hours, like it's like 37 and a half. And you don't do overtime unless you're paid extra and yada, yada, yada. And same, I would say like France, they would always make fun of like, oh, Americans work a lot, but they're not effective. But like I used to work in like a French office, and I can tell you that not much work gets done. Like people come at 9:30, and the first hour and a half you socialize and get coffee, you take a couple calls, and then you have an hour and a half lunch. And for sure you leave like 3 or 4, you gotta get home early. So Americans are way more hardworking, and I respect that. And I think Europeans are lazy. And I think that's shown in the last 30 to 40 years in the lack of success that Europe has had. And Europe is on a fast path to bad things. And that might not be, by the way, true before. Like my grandparents were beyond hardworking, and my parents were quite hardworking, and then our generation, not so much. So this could also be a thing less about the culture for a long time, but about seasonality, where tough times create tough people create good times create soft people create bad times, or whatever that famous quote goes. The point being is my ancestors, my grandparents were very hardworking, my parents were pretty hardworking, and the new generation not so much. And Europeans in general, the wealthier the country it is, the less they work. And Americans, even if they've found financial success, they're still incredibly hardworking. And I think there's a lot to be proud about that. And you can see that in the success of the country, is that just putting in more hours will usually make people better. Now, as an American, you might also say that, hey, the Gen Z don't work much either. I feel like this is every generation says this about the next generation, that they're lazy. And this might be true. Like there's a lot of people who want to be an influencer or whatever and not work in a traditional sense. But when I've met young people, they're very ambitious and they're just putting their work hours into different things versus leisurely activities. But actually, they're working on a craft. That craft might not look like working in a factory or an office anymore, but still, I think most American young people are still hardworking towards their dreams, and that might not be the case with Europeans. And then finally, and this is probably the reason why people love to talk shit about America, is that the world's progress has depended heavily on America. And this is anywhere from like progress of technology companies as of recently, or before that in an industrial revolution. And the thing is, like, because America, people are so hardworking and they're so open-minded to progress too, there's been a lot of startups and new things adopted by the society faster. Versus Europe, if you look at the top companies of Europe, you'll notice that most of them were founded decades, if not hundreds of years ago. And there's less of these new companies. And then if you look at the largest companies in the US, you'll find out that they were launched in the last 10, 20, 30 years. So the speed of progress in America, it's much higher. And because people are open-minded, entrepreneurial, and hardworking, and the society keeps moving forward. I felt this somewhat similar when I was living in Asia myself, is that every day, even if they were poor or not doing so well, people in these Asian countries felt like tomorrow will be better. And having hope about tomorrow makes society be more hardworking, happier, versus if you think tomorrow will be worse or your kids will be worse, then you might have a pessimistic view about the future, and that's kind of a downward spiral. So similarly, America has, despite all of its success, been able to maintain this positive, hopeful attitude. The American dream is still very much alive. It's just morphing into new industries and methods. But in general, the world has a lot to thank for American innovation and progress, and it is the greatest place for entrepreneurship still today. And a lot of people from around the world, the best talent around the world, will move here to build companies and progress the society. Now, I know this is very emotional. If you're American or European, you like to say things that are like supportive of your own agenda. In this video, I try to be as neutral as I can, from having both experiences living in multiple European countries and being raised there for Finland, Suomi, and living almost a decade in the US and married to an American. Both places have their pros and cons. As a rule of thumb, I would say spend your vacations and summers in Europe, and then spend the rest of the year or professional career development, your 20s and 30s in America. That's like what I would recommend. And I think that's a good balance. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Leave a comment below. I would love to hear from you. And hopefully this video brought you a lot of joy and value. If it did, subscribe to The Spore, and see you in the next video.